I've known Tim for 40-some years now. He's a wonderful person. He's taught us very beautiful things. And I was meditating on a book he just wrote last night. And I was thinking, what a wonderful book, because if you practice what he says about overcoming discouragement, then you put a lot of trust in God. You don't get angry so much, you know? And I find that's a tremendous thing. You don't get angry so much, and you're more gentle and kind. I think that's wonderful, gentle way of God, and always encourages people. And there was a time I used to call it love is like a virtual superior. And I would say, Tim, Father Ed, I would like to do this. Oh, Larry, you and Ed work so hard. We're just wonderful people. I take the phone, I hold it out to the what the answer was going to be. He would pray, Father, and then about 2 minutes he would say, no, you can't do what you want to do. He taught me how to praise people. So I'd like to welcome Father Tim.
Now, I'm going to tell a Father Larry story. So I would come here year after year and just see all the wonderful work that's going on here, and I'd say, Father Larry, what you and the priests are doing here is just wonderful. And Father Larry would say, oh, God is so good. And then I would try to say, I know God is so good, but what I'm saying is you guys are doing great work too. Man, is he good. You know? So I would just give up after a while. Well, let's start by, welcome Father Paul. I didn't get a chance to say hi. Yeah. Father Paul has generously volunteered to help with the Holy Hour we'll have a bit later, and then also the Mass. This image of Our Lady is an image that Venerable Bruno Lanteri loved. This is the Marian shrine in the city of Turin, where he lived most of his life, Our Lady of Consolation. And it's an image of Mary that is loved very much and where people have prayed through the centuries and continue to pray. And I'd like, as we begin, to lift our thoughts and our hearts, more than our thoughts, our thoughts, yes, but our hearts above all to Mary. And to use the word that St. John Paul II used, let's entrust what we do this afternoon to Mary. We're all here because we're seeking God's grace. We're all here with our mutual poverty, the poverty with which I can speak and the limitations with which you can listen. Let's entrust all of that, the desire and our limitations, to Mary in the very sure confidence that placed in her mother's heart what we do today will be a time of real grace and blessing for us all. And let's pray the Hail Mary with all of the depth of that meaning. Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So our topic this afternoon, in this afternoon of retreat, is the theme of overcoming spiritual discouragement. And we're going to look at it in the teaching of Venerable Bruno Lanteri. And I've just highlighted that word venerable just to, probably most of us know what that means. It means that this is a man whose cause of canonization is well advanced. In 1965, after about 30 years of study of his life and his writings, the Commission in the Vatican, entrusted with this, recommended to now St. Paul VI that he declare the heroicity of the virtues of Venerable Bruno Lanteri, which he did in 1965. So the only thing needed for his beatification is a verifiable miracle, and then a second one for his canonization. So the Church has studied his life and has recognized that this man lived the same life that we live, the Christian life, but heroically, that there is heroic sanctity in his life. So I'm going to speak of him as Venerable Bruno, and that's the reason for it. It indicates the process of canonization that is well underway in his life. And I'm going to suggest that we begin, before we look at specific writings, let's pray to him for a moment. It's about 9 years ago now. I had an awful lot of retreats going on. My dad had died. I was spending time close to my mom to help her. There was just a lot of pressure. And in the course of it, I began to lose my voice. Finally went to the doctor, and they tried medication. That didn't work. They had a surgery, complications, a second surgery 2 weeks later. And over the next 3 years, another 4 surgeries on the vocal fold. And each time I had that, of course, you lose your voice for a while. For 1 year, did very little priestly ministry, just didn't have the voice for it. And this just kept happening. And you know, if you've been through things like this, how discouraging that gets when it just keeps happening and it doesn't seem to get any better. And it's another surgery and another recovery. Finally, it took me 3 years. I wish it hadn't taken me 3 years, but finally it occurred to me to start saying this prayer that I'm going to invite us to pray now to Venerable Bruno Lanteri, to start praying that every morning, asking for his intercession for the recovery of my voice. And then things started to happen. For example, I was on a trip, and I was taking a medication for some other thing, not related to voice. It got lost in the mail, so I went without it for a few weeks, and my voice got better. And then another doctor, for different reasons, suggested a change of diet, which I did, and found that my voice got better. And things like this just kept happening. And it's been 6 years now since I started praying that prayer every day, and I've had no more surgeries since then. So as you can imagine, I will say that prayer to Venerable Bruno every day of my life. And other intentions now that people have entrusted to me, I include explicitly in that each morning when I say that upon rising. So this is the prayer that I would invite us to pray together. As you'll see, there'll be a pause in the prayer at a certain point at which we can each in silence make our own intentions that we can lift up to this man of God. So let's pray together. O Father, fountain of all light and holiness, you gave Venerable Bruno Lanteri great faith in Christ your Son, a lively hope and an active love for the salvation of his brethren. You made him a prophet of your word and a witness to your mercy. He had a tender love for Mary, and by his very life, fidelity to the Church. Father, hear the prayer of your family, and through the intercession of Venerable Lanteri, grant us the grace for which we now ask. May he be raised to the altars, that we may give you greater praise. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Now, I want to put something into words, and I speak with great reverence here because I know this touches deep places in our hearts. You know how when we meet people and they say, hi, how are you? And we smile and we say, I'm doing fine, things are good. And then we say, how are you? Yeah, things are good. And that's appropriate. Those are the social proprieties. It's obviously appropriate because it's really just a way of saying hello and greeting each other. But if we were to answer that question more slowly and more deeply and more fully, if I may say this reverently, all of us have in our hearts a deep place that isn't always doing well. A deep place in our hearts that no one else sees, that we may never put into words, but that can be discouraged, that is often afraid. And however we say it, we have the sense that God would like me to be here, but I'm down here. I'm not living my vocation well enough. I'm not the mother or the wife that God is calling me to be. I'm not the husband or the father God is calling me to be. I don't live my spiritual life as well as God would wish me to live it. I don't pray very well. I lose my patience. I miss opportunities to help people. Deep in the hearts of all of us, somewhere is a place that can easily be discouraged and afraid. And that's the place that Venerable Bruno knew so sensitively and lovingly and reverently. And he knew how to address it, how to speak to people in that deep place, and how to open up that fear and discouragement in a way that would change people's hearts and change people's lives, and that would bring new hope That's the title, Overcoming Spiritual Discouragement. So that's the space in our hearts that with great reverence and great love and great hope, we're going to look at through the teaching of Venerable Bruno this afternoon. This is my image. Here is a young girl, maybe, let's say, grade school, 8 or 9 years old. And she has acted out at school. And let's say it's kind of serious. She's done something that's pretty seriously wrong. And word has gotten back to her father. The bus drops her off. She walks up the sidewalk toward the front door of the house. She knows her father is inside waiting for her, and she's afraid. She hesitates, but she has to go in. She finally opens the door, and there's her father. And her father doesn't say a word. He simply approaches her, hugs her tightly, and says, "I love you." Now she can say everything. And that's an image of where Venerable Bruno wants to take us, because in that deep place that is afraid in our hearts, we are understood, known, and loved. It's the happiest thing in our lives to know that. And we're going to approach that firstly through some of his letters of spiritual direction. In those days, when travel was difficult, much spiritual direction took place by letter because distances were difficult. Travel was not as easy as it is today. So we have a lot of his spiritual direction through letters. And let's begin by looking at some letters to this woman, Gabriela Solaro de la Margarita. Who was Gabriela? She, as a young woman, had a first marriage. We don't know exactly how long it lasted, not long. Her first husband died fairly shortly after their wedding, and there were no children from that first marriage. Then she remarried to this man, Clemente, and that marriage endured for the rest of her life until her husband's death. And let's look at her husband. Clemente and Gabriela, they're both people like us. Good people, but they have their weaknesses, as we all do. He was somewhat closed emotionally. He was a poor administrator, so he basically left the finances and the property and the care of all of these things to his wife, which didn't make her life all that easy. He would be often absent at times for months at a time. His great passion in life was hunting. It was the sport that he loved. It's what he really loved to do. Variable character. He could be on, he could be off. He could be up, he could be down. He was a bit of a spendthrift, which didn't make things easy for the family either. And he was a good companion to be with if he was with a group of friends just passing time. And he tended somewhat to avoid responsibility. And as I said before, left most of the care of the family property and the finances to his wife, Gabriela. They had 6 children. The first 2 boys, Carlo and Vittorio, died at an early age. This was much more common in those days than it is now with the advance of medicine. But you can imagine the hurt in this mother's heart. Her first 2 sons both die at a young age. Her next son, Clemente, is famous in Italian history. Picture of him as he was a statesman. He was the equivalent of our Secretary of State for Venerable Bruno's little nation up in northern Italy, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as he was called in that day. And he wrote a book which is a classic in Italian history. I've highlighted in red his name. You can see it, Clemente Solaro de la Margarita. And in translation, the title is called Historical Political Memorandum. Now, her son is well known in Italian history as a man who, in a time not much different than our own, when it was becoming increasingly difficult to publicly be a Catholic, and in which persecutions had been present and were looming, in fact would come not too much further down the line in Italian history. In a government and political setting that was hostile to the church, he was a firm, staunch, and faithful Catholic, most likely because as a young man he was a spiritual directee of Venerable Bruno, as was his mother. And so those who were faithful to the church loved this man. He was a solid, strong Catholic politician in the midst of the political world. Of course, those who did not look favorably on the church correspondingly did not see him in a good light. Every indication is, and his great-nephew, Clemente's great-nephew, was a witness in the cause of canonization for Venerable Bruno and testified that the family tradition, for a number of solid reasons, has always held that Clemente was directed spiritually by Venerable Bruno when Clemente was in Turin doing his studies. And then the next two were twins, Giuseppina and Gabriela. Giuseppina became a sister. Gabriela married and had a long family life with children. And her youngest son, Enrico, also died at an early age, as we'll see. Gabriela, if we look at her life, she lived 71 years, and those are the years, 1771 through 1842. Now, these were not peaceful years in her life. When she was 18, in 1789, the French Revolution exploded just across the mountains in France, which led then to wars throughout all of Europe, the political occupation. When she was 25, so just 7 years later, her own country in northern Italy was taken over by the French armies. Napoleon defeated them. And for the next 20 years, they would be a politically occupied country and a country in which the church would be persecuted. When she was 43, finally the occupation ended and her country regained its freedom. During those years, by the way, 1796 through 1814, so through those 20 years, the French, when they came through with their armies, they simply took the family property and family house, evicted Gabriela and the family. They had to survive as best they could. And when finally they were defeated and Gabriela and her family could return to their home, the biographer tells us that the only thing the French could have done to damage the property more would have been just to burn it down completely. They had stolen everything, the house was ruined. And this was another thing when they returned, that Gabriela, without too much help from her husband, had to reestablish the family house and property, even as she was raising her children. We have a description of Gabriela in a book written by Clemente's great-nephew, who wrote a biography of his well-known and famous great-uncle. And he describes Gabriela in this way. She was a woman of interior strength. She was a strong woman. She was capable, she could make decisions, she could take leadership. With something virile about her, high-minded, energetic, sure of herself, accustomed to lead and to make decisions, with both the strengths and the liabilities that kind of strength of character brings with it. She was of a meditative nature, strong in character, with a particular modesty, a good heart under a cold exterior. She struggled also to show emotion. Constant of will, so when she set her will on something, she would see it through, and inclined to the good. This was a good woman. Faithful Catholic, obviously undergoing spiritual direction as well. But a little impatient, almost sharp, firm and sincere in her judgments, but often too exclusive and narrow in them. She would see it this way, and that was the way it was, and it would not be easy for her to change her view of things. She was severe in her behavior and tastes, yet with a great pride in her parentage, her family, and social position, hardly, somewhat, but not fully balanced by a Christian sense of humility. So this is Gabriela. I shared this earlier in another parish, and one of the persons there told me at the end, it's really nice to see the spiritual life lived by people like us. This is not St. Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross or Francis of Assisi that we look up to, and rightfully so, but this is people like us. Good people, people of faith, who love the Lord with their strengths and their limitations, and how do we live the spiritual life? Okay, so that's who the Gabriela is to whom Venerable Bruno is writing. All right, so let's, if you take in the handouts, this will be the purple handout that you have. Where we have 3 letters of Venerable Bruno to Gabriela. What is it? Pink or purple, whatever it is. Peach. We'll call it, isn't Peach, but we'll call it that. All right. So let's take the first of these letters. So he writes to her, "My lady and my daughter in Jesus Christ, your letter just arrived." And this is very often the way he'll write letters. She writes to him, sharing her spiritual experience, and then he will write in response to her. "Your letter just arrived. I was glad to receive it, and it gave me real joy." Now you'll always notice in Venerable Bruno that he always leads with the heart. I received your letter, I was happy to receive it, and it gave me real joy. That's always the first thing you're going to get from him is his heart is right there. And even on the human level, just I'm really happy to hear from you. And all the more because her news is good. It gave me real joy. I am happy to hear that your trip went well, whatever the trip was, and that your whole family is in good health. So this is the time of relative stability for Gabriela. Now she's asked his help with the following question, and he gives his thought. "I see no reason why you may not entrust your little Louise." This is not one of her own daughters. It may be a niece, or in some way she's involved in the family, and Gabriela has been asked to take responsibility for her. "I see no reason why you may not entrust your little Louise to your dear sister, the Lady Countess Vidua. She could not be in better hands, and the reasons for doing so are many. In my view, you may do this with total peace of heart." So you'll note that when Venerable Bruno begins his response to her, he begins on the level of the family, on the human level. Just different things that are happening in the family, questions along those lines. So he doesn't start immediately with the spiritual, and this is a pattern with him. He'll start with the human, he reverences it, recognizes it, shares in it, but then fairly quickly will move to where his heart really is, and that's the spiritual level, and that's where he turns now in this letter. All right, so if it gives me happiness that things are going well in your family, it gives me greater happiness still. This is where the greatest joy in his heart is because of what's just happened spiritually. "It gives me greater happiness still to know that Father Ferrero is already there with you." Now, in those days, sometimes, and you still see this if you go to Italy, some of the larger properties would have their own chapel. So it may be that this Father Ferrero has just come as a chaplain to a chapel on the family property, or just some nearby church. But what it means is that now Gabriela has access to the Mass throughout the week and access to communion. And he's just really happy that this is the case. Now note where he starts. When he turns to the spiritual life, what's the first thing he turns to? The Eucharist. What does the Church call the Eucharist in our lives? The source, and that's pretty nice that the people can say that. The source and summit, that's the center of everything in the spiritual life. And that's the first place Venerable Bruno turns. So that if you were to go to him for spiritual direction, what you'd find is it wouldn't take very long before he'd be talking to you about the Eucharist, about the Mass, and the place that can have in your spiritual life. "It gives me greater happiness still to know that Father Ferrero is already there with you. It is important then," now note the next two words because these are key words for Venerable Bruno. "It is important then to do what? Begin. We're going to see him say this over and over again. In fact, when I wrote the biography of his life, so much so that when I wrote the biography of his life, that was the title of it. Begin, again, begin. So what he's saying is, you have access to valuable, fruitful, rich spiritual resources. Don't wait. Act. Begin. Start using them. And begin when? What's the next word? To begin? Yeah, you're going to see these two words come back over and over again in Bruno. Choose solid spiritual practices and then start. And don't wait. So if any of us knows that here's the next step and it's possible and I can do it and I sense the Lord is calling me to it, don't wait. Begin. Immediately. Now. It's a lovely teaching. All right, to do what? So it is important then to begin immediately to do what? To arrange with him for receiving communion and to do so as often as you can. Now in Venerable Bruno's time, this is kind of remarkable because in his time, very often the practice was that a person would go to communion just once a year, if that. Remember the Easter time and the annual communion. And regular, ongoing, frequent, even daily communion was not very common in those days. So this is all the more important that Venerable Bruno is saying, you have access to the Eucharist, stay as close to it as you can. Basically what he's saying to her, if we translate it into our terms today, can you get to Mass during the week? Then go as often as you can. And get to communion as many days as you can. This is the first and most important thing in living the spiritual life. Consciously, that's where he begins, because it is the source and the center. What is the Eucharist, finally? Jesus. His death and resurrection, it's the living Jesus in his mystery of dying and rising in our midst. Of course, it's the center, it's the summit, it's the source, it's everything. So if any one of us is saying, I really feel the need to get closer to God in my life, what can I do? Can you get to daily Mass more often? For some of us, that may not be possible, and let's reverence that, as we'll see. He knows that not everything is always possible. Would it be possible to get there a few times during the week? For some of us, perhaps many, daily Mass may be possible. We can do nothing better in the spiritual life than to get as close as we can, compatibly with our with our responsibilities and duties in life, to get as close to the Eucharist as we can. And then he continues, you must be consistently faithful to what? To meditation and to spiritual reading. Now note what follows, because this is a busy woman with a family of 4 children that she's raising, financial responsibilities, a household, all the different things that she's dealing with. You must be consistently faithful. So these next things that he's going to mention, always be faithful to them. Well, what are they? 2 spiritual practices, meditation and spiritual reading. And then he gets very practical. If it be only a quarter of an hour of meditation and a single page of spiritual reading. So, Venerable Bruno encourages her and us, don't let a day pass. Be as consistently faithful as you can to taking in spiritual nourishment every day through meditation. For some of us, that may be Ignatian reflective meditation, Ignatian imaginative contemplation. It may be Lectio Divina. It may be the Liturgy of the Hours. It may be the Rosary. Or it may be any one of the many solid ways of praying that our rich spiritual tradition gives us. Learn enough about them to make your own choice of what you find most helpful. And then Venerable Bruno says, do it every day. And then one of us says, I'd love to do that, but I have children, I have a family, I work, I have responsibilities, I have issues of health. And Venerable Bruno answers, I know that you're busy. God doesn't ask the impossible of you. Can you find 15 minutes in a day to spend with this kind of meditative prayer? Rosary, Lectio Divina, reading scripture prayerfully, etc. Can you find 15 minutes a day? Well, probably I could. And then he says, begin. I know many of us are already doing this. If for any of us this would be a beginning, then begin. And begin when? Immediately. Don't wait. Because this is such a blessing in the spiritual life. Well, I don't know I remember one woman telling me that the only way she could pray, she had young children, was to go in the bathroom and lock the door. Could you listen to a rosary app while you're driving to pick up the children after school? Yes. Could you listen to a recorded conference about the faith while you're exercising? Or preparing a meal, or driving? Can you find 15 minutes in the course of a day to take in spiritual nourishment of a meditative kind? And this is what Venerable Bruno is strongly encouraging this woman who is a wife and mother, raising children, and everything that we've said. And then another practice which is very dear to Venerable Bruno, which he practiced throughout his life and recommended over and over again, and that is spiritual reading. And he says, if it be just a single page of spiritual reading. Well, Father, I'd love to read, but my life is so busy. I somehow just never seem to get time. It's just very difficult ever to find time to read. Let's amplify it today. Today, this would certainly include digital resources. As I say, talks on YouTube, apps, and all of these kinds of things. So we're so blessed today to have such a richness of a variety of ways in which we can take in spiritual nourishment. I don't know, Father, that I'll ever get time to read like that. Well, could you read one page a day? Well, probably I could. Then what? Do what? And when? Yeah, and be consistently faithful. What's going to happen if we do that? If never a day goes by but we don't take in spiritual nourishment, our faith will always be alive and fresh and growing and new. A couple of years ago, I conceived the project of reading all of the writings of Saint Therese of the Child Jesus. There are actually quite a lot of them if you look at the letters and the poems and everything that she's written. It took me about 1.5 years in the midst of other occupations to go through that. It was one of the best things I've done in recent years. Just every day taking in spiritual nourishment like that. Something wonderful comes into your spiritual life. And so Venerable Bruno says to this woman who is as busy as we are today, you need this. You need this daily kind of nourishment. Even if it's just one page. I will bet that there is not one person in this building right now who cannot read one page a day from a spiritual book. Or listen for 5 minutes to a Catholic podcast. Or listen to 5 minutes of a conference on YouTube or on an app, etc. One time I posted this part of the letter at the beginning of Lent. I posted it on Facebook, and the comments were beautiful. People would say, you know, you set up a program at the beginning of Lent and you wonder, can I keep all this up? Well, people said, that's doable. That's doable. And this will always be Venerable Bruno. What he will propose to people will always be very doable in the real circumstances of their lives. And then a further spiritual practice. He says, and the same also for the examination of conscience, which you can do while you are working. All right? With reverence, and don't raise any hands here, how many of us feel that we probably should do better with the examination of conscience that we really do? Well, I'll raise my hand. It's a lot of us. You know, that sense that we have that I really should do this at the end of the day, but I'm tired, and so if we're doing it, you know, we kind of get through it a little more quickly than we have a sense that we really ought to. So a couple things to say about this. One is there is a big difference between a spiritual life in which we never look back over our spiritual experience and a spiritual life in which we, at least for a few minutes every day, review the spiritual experience of the day. What we speak of today as the examen prayer. There's a big difference in that because you see things, and with the Lord you get light, and you can make new choices to do things better as you go forward. There's always a kind of growth going on day after day if we are reflective or reviewing our spiritual experience. So, Gabriela, in effect, would say to Venerable Bruno, I'd love to do that, but there are children to be put to bed, meals to dishes, all of this. I'm so tired. Yes, that's very true, and let's reverence that. Is there a time in the course of your day when your hands are busy, but your mind can be free? Your heart can be free? In which you could, with the Lord, even as you work, review your day. And she would probably answer like us, yes, that probably would be possible. See what it would be like to go to Venerable Bruno for spiritual direction? you'd come out with clarity, and you wouldn't come out overwhelmed with the sense that they're asking of me things I can't do. You have a sense he really knows my life. He knows how busy and hectic and scattered it is. But he also knows that it's possible to choose solid spiritual practices, choose an amount of them that is sustainable, and to do it every day, which makes all the difference. Look at the fruit in this woman's case. Look at her son, for example, and the good that he did on a national level in their nation. And then the stable marriage of her daughter, the religious life of her daughter, it's worth doing. The benefits flow out. And she, Gabriela, as we've seen, was not a perfect woman. She was like us. She was a good woman, a woman of faith, sincere about her faith, who had her struggles, as we all do. And yet her life, because she tried to live this kind of thing, became so wonderfully fruitful and blessed her family, and through her family, so many others. All right, so those are the formal times of prayer. What about the rest of the day? Do not forget to raise your heart how often? Do not forget to raise your heart frequently. And then these next two words are classic Venerable Bruno. So do not forget to raise your heart frequently, but gently and with peace. So one thing you will never get from Venerable Bruno, here is one of us who says, I could do this extra good work, but I know that it's going to mean straining to use the last little bit of exhausted energy that I have. I could add this extra time of prayer, but it will mean getting up an hour earlier, and I know I'm going to be exhausted as the days go along. I could add this extra thing, and I can do it when everything's going smoothly in my life, but I know that things never stay smooth. There are always things that interrupt it, and it's going to be hard to sustain. If ever you find yourself thinking of doing something in the spiritual life that you can only do at the cost of exhaustion, of spending the last bit of energy that you have, of white-knuckling, of stretching and pushing in a way that you can't sustain, then know that God is not asking that of you. So Venerable Bruno will always say in all of his spiritual direction, yes, do these things. Choose solid spiritual practices, choose an amount that's sustainable in realistic terms in your life, and then be consistently faithful with it. But do it all gently and with peace. People must have loved that, to hear that. Just that God isn't asking that kind of strain and stretching and exhaustion from us. It's like Jesus who says to the disciples, things are so busy that they can't even eat. And he says, come away for a while and rest. It's a beautiful message to hear from God. And this is always Venerable Bruno. Do not forget to raise your heart frequently, but gently and with peace to God. So what he's suggesting to her as you're preparing meals, as you're seeing about the household things, as you're interacting with your children and the busyness of the activity of the day, frequently, often throughout the day, just gently and with peace, lift up your heart to God, just to be aware of God. I just heard a priest tell me of a monk who was appointed abbot of his monastery. And as he began, he gathered all the monks and he said to them, I want to ask all of you every day to stop 7 times during the day for 1 minute each time, to do nothing other than just praise and adore and worship God. He said within a year they were all contemplatives. So, we're not monks. But if we can lift our hearts, as Venerable Bruno says, in the midst of a busy day, and you can do it. You finish one phone call and you answer an email, and maybe before you answer the next one, you take just a moment to lift your heart gently and with peace to God. It doesn't add any time to the day, but it changes everything. One of the happiest lines I have always thought in the entire Gospels is this. When Jesus says to the disciples, I am not alone. I am not alone. Because the Father is with me. Because he always knows that there is one with him who knows him, understands him, loves him, will always be with him unshakably. So much can change in our lives when we learn through this just frequently, peacefully lifting our hearts to God, that we are not alone. And that's what he is inviting Gabriela to do through the busyness of the hours of her day. Do not forget to raise your heart frequently, but gently and with peace to God. All right, what about mortification? Classic act of the spiritual life in our tradition. But watch how he adapts it to her busy, hectic days and to her specific personal character. Do not forget to make acts of mortification. Of what kind? Especially, so not exclusively, they can be exterior, but especially, above all, interior ones. So interior mortification of the heart. Mortification in what we say, for example, or we hold back the angry words, or we don't let the impatient show, or we be kind to a person when we don't feel like being kind, and all of this. This is what he means by interior mortification. It's a kind of putting to death, which is what mortification means, a putting to death of the self on an interior level, on the level of the heart. And so he's not saying to her, I want you to be doing a strict fast 5 days a week. You know, I want you to sleep on a plank of wood with a block of wood as a pillow. Now those things have their place in some of the saints' lives and so on. So I'm not at all saying that those are not there, but he knows this. He knows that she can't do that. But there is something she can do. You see, very often we feel, well, I can't do those great things that saints have done, and so we unhappily feel like we have to settle for less. You don't have to. There is a way to do all of these classic spiritual practices that fits, that harmonizes with the vocation that God has given us, whether as married men and women, in the single condition, for us as priests and religious, whatever it might be. And like a wise spiritual guide, he knows how to help Gabriela to live these spiritual practices in a way that fits with her life and strengthens her. So, and to make acts of mortification, especially interior ones, and then he gets even more specific. He's in spiritual guidance, he's never generic. It's always adapted to the person. For you, with her strong character that can get impatient and sharp, for you, this means the effort to live each moment with a gentle and joyful spirit. You know what's coming to mind as I say this? I had a priest told me once that he would go regularly to spiritual direction, and the other priests with whom he lived, always, they could sense when he'd been to spiritual direction because he was just more at peace and easier to get along with and all the rest of that. And so he said every so often, they'd say to him, you know, isn't it time for you to go to spiritual direction? Well, my sense is that it must have been like that for Gabriela too, when she would get one of these letters, or on the rare occasions when they might meet. They wouldn't be able to meet very often, maybe once a year, maybe a couple times. But I'm sure the family would have seen the difference. You know, just she becomes gentler, less impatient, less sharp, warmer. And that's what this is the mortification that you need. Put to death that part of you that gets sharp and impatient and can be difficult to live with, and seek to live with a gentle and joyful spirit. Now the next is said about as strongly as he can say it. For the love of God, so that's the strongest motivation that he can express. For the love of God, I beg of you. All right? For the love of God, I beg of you what? What is it that he so warmly, strongly encourages of her? I beg of you to wage continual warfare against negative moods. Okay, you can see, again, he knows Gabriela well, that she can fall into these. And humanly, there was a reason for it. Her life was not easy. And so he says, wage war. Warfare is a strong word. Militant. Battle. Don't give in to this. Fight against giving in to negative moods. Critical, sharp, discouraged, isolating, all the rest of this. What if we did that? Let me just say his words to each one of us here present, myself and you. For the love of God, I beg of you to wage continual warfare against any negative moods, when you feel yourself sinking into isolation and discouragement and sharpness and impatience and all the rest of this. Wage warfare against that. And the next is about as classic Venerable Bruno as we'll ever get. I beg of you to wage continual warfare against negative moods and never fail to do what?
Begin again.
Never fail to begin again. He will say this over and over and over. That's actually, as I mentioned, that's the title of the biography, Begin Again, because this is something that he would say over and over again. So let's look, let me say this before we look at that. Is there, don't raise any hands here, is there anyone in this church who feels with a certain discouragement that I'm not what the Lord really wants me to be? There were those years in my life, there was that occasion in my life, there is this ongoing thing in my life that is not what God wants. And I feel unable to change it. I keep falling into this over and over again. And there's the discouragement. And Venerable Bruno replies, as I said when we began, he knows this deep place in our hearts that's afraid and that is discouraged, that doesn't stop us from being faithful, but that weighs on us. He knows that place. And so right there he says to us, there is never anything you can have done in your life or be part of your life now, never anywhere you can have been in your life that can ever stop you right now from turning to God, and if it's appropriate, if you need it, asking his forgiveness, which he is eager to give, delights to give. Look at the Father running to meet the prodigal son. And then beginning again. I have seen that teaching instill hope in many people's lives, and it means an awful lot in my life too, because like you, I can get into points where I feel like I missed an opportunity, I didn't use that time well, didn't do as well as the Lord would have wanted me in this, and then I'll remember this. Begin again. Oh yeah, I can do that. And begin again when? Immediately. Now, don't wait. Again, if Venerable Bruno is speaking to the heart of any one of us here who is carrying that kind of discouragement, then with gently and with peace, but with warm encouragement and insistence, let him touch that place in your heart and say to your heart, there's nothing that's stopping you. There's no door that's closed. All you have to do, and it can be done now, immediately, is just bring that place in your heart to God. If you need it, ask his forgiveness, which he thrills to give, is eager to give. And then you begin again. It is never too late in the spiritual life. We never have to settle for less in our spiritual lives. All we have to do is just begin. I remember a woman who made a retreat in our retreat house near Boston, and they have this saying of Venerable Bruno on a placard on the wall. And she had a fine retreat, a lot of grace, but the one thing that she mentioned to me was just walking by that placard every day on the wall and seeing it and how much that meant to her. Just begin again, begin again. So already some key elements of Venerable Bruno's spiritual guidance have emerged. When you plan your spiritual life, be as close to the Eucharist as you can. Try to find at least 15 minutes of some form of meditative prayer. If you can do more, that's beautiful. But if you're struggling to find time, can you find at least 15 minutes? And I suspect the answer is yes, you can. Can you do one page of spiritual reading or spend a few minutes listening to a Catholic podcast or talk on YouTube or CD? And pray the examine prayer, the examination of conscience into which spiritual experience is incorporated. Can you do that at least while your hands are busy but your mind can be free? Is there any one of us who cannot do this? My bet is that there is not. So, This is Venerable Bruno's counsel for our spiritual lives. Begin by choosing solid spiritual practices, above all the Eucharist. Of course, he'll mention confession in some of his subsequent writings. Meditation, spiritual reading, examine, lifting our hearts frequently to God throughout the day. Choose a sustainable amount of time. I'd like to pray for an hour, but I know I can't get that amount of time. What amount of time can you sustain? Well, probably half an hour, maybe just 15 minutes. Choose a sustainable amount of time. Then be faithful. You must be consistently faithful. And this he is very strong on this. You've got solid spiritual practices that will nourish you. You have a sustainable amount of time. Then don't give up on them. Be faithful to them consistently, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. All right, what if you fail? What if it falls apart and a week has gone by and I've hardly done it? If you fail, do what? There's never anything stopping you from just beginning again, and do it with peace and gently. Do all of it gently and with peace. That's one way of describing Venerable Bruno's spiritual guidance. It is. It is doable. All right. Now let's have him turn to the rest of the day, because all of the day is to be lived with God, not just the formal times of prayer. So he says, do not wait until you have devotion. Now, by devotion, what he means is a warm sense of consolation, a feeling of God's closeness. So one of us says, well, I go to Mass, I receive communion, I try to do the meditation, the spiritual reading, but I don't feel any warmth in my heart. Maybe I'm not really capable of this. Maybe it's for other people who are closer to God than I am. I don't have that kind of devotion and warmth, holiness and so forth that other people seem to have. And so Venerable Bruno knows that place in our heart and addresses it. Do not wait. This is always Venerable Bruno. Don't wait. Do not wait until you have devotion to begin these things. Begin even without devotion. Even if you don't feel any warmth and so forth, begin now, because that's exactly how the devotion is going to come. Through fidelity to these kinds of doable, solid, sustainable practices. Begin even without devotion, since that will come with time, and this is precisely the means to attain it. Devotion must be the fruit, not the cause, of the practices I have recommended. So again, with reverence, if there's anyone here who feels other people can hope to be holy, I don't think I can ever really hope for that, just given who I am and all my failures. And Venerable Bruno says, no, it's you too, it's for you too. It's for every one of us. You don't feel the warmth of God's closeness, just be faithful to these practices and you'll see that all of this is going to come in God's way in time. I did a funeral once of a woman who died in her, I think, mid-80s, and it was a very beautiful time of prayer in the sense that her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren were there. The church was packed. Very much loved, a very faithful, just really a wonderful Catholic wife and mother, a long and faithful life. And I was talking with a man afterwards who had, in the course of the funeral, had learned something about this woman's life. And he said, this is another one of those saints who will never be canonized. It's a beautiful line. It's what every one of us is called to be. And it's doable. It's doable, it's real. And here's the outline. It applies to every one of us. For the rest, you know that true devotion consists in readiness to be, devotion, we would say holiness today, consists in readiness to be faithful to the Lord and not in sentiment. I hope that you will soon send me consoling news in this regard. And you can see here that spiritual direction is being done by letter. I hope that it won't be too long before you'll write again, and you'll be able to send me positive news about what's happening with everything that I've recommended to you. I ask you to give my greetings to Father Cesare. We don't really know, so some priest in the area that the Venerable Bruno knows of but has not met. I ask you to give my greetings to Father Cesare and to tell him that I would be happy to see him here. He helped a lot of priests. And that I always hope to be able one day to visit with him there. For the present, tell Father Ferrero, so this is the chaplain who is recently appointed to the area, tell Father Ferraro that even though I have not yet had the joy of meeting him, I ask him to give you no rest in committing yourself to practicing all that I have just recommended to you, and to call you strictly to account. So it's all wrapped in gentleness, peace, sustainability, solid practices, but once you have them in place, about this, Venerable Bruno will not weaken. Be faithful, be faithful, be faithful. We'll see him use this phrase over and over again of a holy tenacity. Not to unsustainable things, but to sustainable things. And I will be grateful to him for this. I bless you, and so again returns to the more human level. I bless you together with all your family. I recommend myself to your prayers, and I am with the highest esteem and respect your servant and Father in Jesus Christ, Father Lanteri. Oh wow, it's already time for our break here. All right, can we take about a 10-minute break? And then 10 minutes from now I'll start talking again.